me that you have no idea where it goes and what happens to it.
To the best of my knowledge, it goes into our congressional affairs shop. Someone in the organization answers it.
And who do they?
Comes up to, if it's for my signature, the return, that would come up to me for review most of the time. Let me also just note, of all the letters people are talking about, there's a lot of individual constituent mail that comes into the IRS.
So you get a lot of mail.
Much of which I don't see.
But do you see all the letters from members of Congress?
Do I? To the best of my knowledge, I do, the ones to me.
So you got 132 members of Congress. The House.
Let me actually repeat, if it's something that someone else is going to take care of, I might not have seen it. But the ones you're referring to, Mr. Bustani's, Mr. Camp's.
Mr. Hatch, the 12 senators, did you see that letter?
Yes.
When he says this was a lie by omission, how do you respond to that?
My belief is that, well, first of all, the letter in question was not under my signature. And second,
he's made a fairly serious charge. I want to know what you think of this idea of lie by omission.
I disagree with it.
And that will have to conclude. We now go to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Spear.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Schulman, you have been the head of the IRS for over 5 years. You're in charge of the Internal Revenue Service, correct?
I was head of the IRS for 4 years and about 8 months.
All right, 4 years and 8 months. You get 132 letters from members of Congress concerned about targeting, and you send them to Leg Affairs to deal with. Did you feel any responsibility to go to the Cincinnati office and find out for yourself what was going on? Did you ever make a visit to the Cincinnati office?
I guess I don't accept the premise that I got 132 letters about targeting. I certainly wasn't aware of that number till now. I knew about 2 questions.
Well, regardless, when Congress contacts you, whether it's 12 senators or members of this committee, I mean, doesn't it alert you to the fact that, maybe if there's smoke, maybe there's fire? So did you ever visit the Cincinnati office?
I visited early in my tenure the Cincinnati office, which has many different operations, but I don't believe I went to Cincinnati during this 2012 time.
Do you take responsibility for what happened in the Cincinnati office?
Do I take responsibility for the list?
Yes.
Being done? I don't take personal responsibility for there being a list with criteria put on it. But I do accept the fact that this did happen on my watch.
So you don't take responsibility, but you recognize the fact that it happened under your watch?
Look, I recognize that this happened on my watch, and I'm very sorry that this happened while I was at the Internal Revenue Service.
One of the problems we have here is people are unwilling to take responsibility for actions that happen under their command. And you had a duty, as far as I'm concerned, to find out what was going on in the Cincinnati office when members of Congress, 132 of them or 50 of them or 10 of them, inform you that they think that there's some kind of targeting going on. And if that doesn't elevate your concern and interest, then something's fundamentally wrong between the way Congress interacts with the administration and the bureaucracy. Now, Mr. George, the law is that a 501c4 must operate exclusively for the social welfare. That's what the law says, correct?
That is yes, that's correct.
Exclusively for social welfare purposes.
Yes.
And somewhere along the line, the IRS came out with a regulation that reduced it to primarily. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
So does the regulation trump the statute?
Well, I'm not here to give legal advice. That is, as an attorney, that is my understanding, that a regulation does not trump a statute, but a regulation can be used to elaborate on the intent of the statute.
So if we just look at those 2 words, exclusively and primarily, there's a dramatic difference, correct?
Yes, in my view.
And if regulation can't trump statute, then everything that's been going on here relative to authorizing 501c4s, if they're not exclusively being used for social service purposes, is violative of the law, correct?
I would say yes, but we have to keep in mind there may have been court interpretations that between the passage of the legislation and the implementation of this passage of the statute and the implementation of the regulation. So, and I don't have the history of
All right.
Congresswoman.
In your review of this situation, have you identified in Cincinnati the individuals who have developed this BOLO list?
We have not yet, ma'am.
And why not?
We have had some difficulty in terms of getting clarity from some of the IRS employees we've interviewed. Keep in mind, this is an audit. The people we have been interacting with were not under oath. And so if this matter develops further and changes its character, that might change the willingness of people to be more forthcoming with the information.
Now, the committee yesterday interviewed Holly Paz, who's the manager of the Ruling and Agreement Office in the Washington, D.C. And for at least part of the time period in question, she oversaw approximately 300 employees in Cincinnati unit that determines whether organizations qualify for tax-exempt status. She said that she was the first person in Washington office to learn about the use of inappropriate criteria in June of 2011. Do you agree with that? Is that consistent with your report?
I have no information on that, but if you'll, I beg your indulgence for 1 minute.
The gentlelady's time has expired, but you can continue to answer.
We do not have any information on that, Congresswoman.
I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. We now go to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg. Would you give me just 2 seconds of yielding?
2 seconds, I certainly
With
will.
the gentlelady, my colleague from California, the Center for American Progress and Organize for American Action and others are 501c4s. This is not new. President Obama uses a 501c4.
Will the gentleman yield?
It's the gentleman's time.
I will yield briefly.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, regardless of whether it's a Democratic, a progressive, a conservative, a Republican organization, laws we have should be enforced. And a statute was trumped by a regulation. We should all be concerned about that. I yield back.
And if I can clarify for all of us, this change in 1959, there's a whole lot of water over the dam since 1959. And I think that it's important today to realize that without congressional action, trumping a 1959 by the IRS would be legislating without a doubt. And I think the IG, in including it in his audit, told all of us essentially that the Ways and Means Committee has, in fact, a challenge to deal with, which is, do we really want it the way it is as it is evolved in use? But ultimately, the decision since 1959 has caused organizations that perhaps all of us have grown to like. The 501c3s, like the American Lung Association, endorses legislative initiatives, as you know, in California. They promote initiatives and so on. They do it as a minority of what they do. So I think one of the challenges for this committee, and I would only ask us all to think about it in this term, is Ways and Means has authority to change the law or to essentially trump a regulation. In our case, we have primary responsibility to ask questions like, should the IG have known sooner and we've been reported? Should Mr. Schulman have been a better manager than he was? And if so, how do we ensure in the future that Mr. Wolin, for example, would in fact have known with specificity sooner? I think that's our lane, and I only would say that as chair because our lane is not unlimited. The jurisdiction of the Ways and Means as to laws governing the IRS does not belong in this committee. And I know all of us on this committee are very proud that we do a lot of work. The one thing we don't do is we don't pass tax law. Although we all have opinions on it, let me assure you. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank the chairman, and I'd ask unanimous consent to have my full 5 minutes restored. I mean, it's been interesting listening to the accounts here of 118 visits to the White House by Mr. Schulman, no talk about this specific issue, no talk about related issues during those 118 visits, 132 letters coming from members of Congress, 42 articles in newspapers, and frankly, we just had the opportunity now of having the press really get engaged with it. But 42 over that course of time. I also look at a train of events. September 2010, Senate Finance Committee Chairman Baucus wrote a letter to the IRS asking the IRS to survey tax-exempt organizations to ensure that political campaign activity is not the organization's primary activity. October 2010, Senator Durbin wrote to the IRS to review the purposes and activities of several tax-exempt organizations. February 2012, Senators Bennett, Franken, Merkley, Schumer, Shaheen, Udall, and Whitehouse wrote to the IRS about the issue. 32 Democrats in March of 2012, 12 House Democrats wrote to the IRS and the White House to ask that political activity of tax-exempt organizations be investigated. July and August of 2012, Senator Levin sent letters to the IRS and said that the IRS appears to be passively standing by while organizations clearly ignore the tax code with no apparent consequences. Now, this to me seems like a significant amount of requests for information and concerns that private citizens, organizations seeking tax-exempt status who happen to be of the conservative side would be checked on and questioned. Now, I find it difficult, Mr. Woolen, to understand how that didn't come across your train of reference and responsibility earlier on. Did you ever discuss congressional interest in the way the IRS was handling political nonprofits with the president?
I did not, Congressman, never.
Did you ever discuss it with anyone at the White House or any agency outside the IRS?
I did not, Congressman.
Why didn't you discuss this when you knew it was of such interest to Congress, and you knew Congress was apparently not satisfied with whatever actions the agency had taken thus far on either side of the issue?
Frankly, Congressman, the correspondence to which you referred did not come to me. I think it was in general, as you suggested, addressed to the IRS, and I frankly was unaware of this, of the concern until...
But Treasury has intense responsibility and ought to have intense scrutiny over the IRS, correct?
Well, Congressman, I think it's important for me to reiterate that with respect to the details of tax administration and tax enforcement, it's been the long-standing practice of Treasury Departments spanning administrations of Republican and Democratic presidents not to get involved in those details, specifically because we don't want to have political influence over those kinds of detailed activities with respect to tax administration. I think this is a hearing and a subject matter that makes clear why that's not a good idea.
Not a good idea. Mr. Schulman, when did you learn about the second BOLO again and the failure of employees to follow explicit directions from their superiors?
About the fact that there was a BOLO and then a second BOLO and that employees hadn't followed directions?
Yes.
That I didn't learn about until this last week when the report came out.
Wow. Were you involved in any discussions about disciplining people who were being insubordinate in the Cincinnati office?
Not that I remember.
In Politico today, I see this headline here: heads won't roll at the IRS. Heads won't roll at the IRS. Labor rules give workers protection. The amount of ineptitude, and it's assuming that a Fifth Amendment was requested by Ms. Lerner, who's not here, we have to assume that there's some concern about criminality as well. What does it take for someone to get disciplined at the IRS?
There's, at the IRS, there's, procedures that people follow. Workers have.
And people don't follow, I would guess.
And there's a union, so it depends if it's somebody in the union or not. The best of my knowledge, it's the kinds of procedures you would think about in any organization.
Well, specifically,
which is to,
while you were commissioner,
go over it.
I only have 4 seconds. While you were commissioner, for what reasons did you discipline some individuals at the IRS while you were commissioner?
inappropriate conduct, not doing their job, those kinds of things.
Wow. And we missed all of this. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I want to say I am deeply troubled, and I know I speak for the entire panel. We are all deeply troubled by what has happened at the IRS, and perhaps the most troubling part is that the IRS has been revealed to have targeted groups for their political beliefs, their political leanings. It's an outrage if this is true, and I want to drill down a little bit with you, Mr. George. You're the Inspector General. Last week, you testified in front of the House Ways and Means Committee to the effect that from your looking into this matter, whether you call it an audit or an investigation, from your looking into this matter, you saw no evidence that IRS employees were politically motivated in their creation or use of the inappropriate screening criteria. Was that essentially your testimony?
That we received no evidence during the course of our audit to that effect, yes, sir.
All right, so that doesn't really square with the headline that the groups were targeted by the IRS for their political beliefs and political leanings. And I want to ask you, I mean, isn't it true? People do things for a reason. If people at the IRS came up with improper ways of going about their business, improperly triaged groups with political sounding names to the top of the list for extra scrutiny, if they did those things and it wasn't for political reasons, why did they do it?
Congressman, there are reasons for the IRS to issue be on the lookout types of directives, and without violating any, I don't want to say secrets, but without giving the bad guys a way of avoiding detection. I will point out that in the case of terrorists, or terroristic activities, both domestic and international, there may be a reason for the IRS to be on the lookout for a particular type of application or something of the like.
Well, one thing that Mr. Connolly mentioned earlier this morning was the doubling of the applications that we saw after the Supreme Court's decision in January of 2010 in Citizens United. And that's true. Is that correct?
It is correct, but I want to make sure that I'm clear about that. Our audit did not say this was as a direct result of that. It was right. Coincidental.
And you're anticipating my next question. Whether or not we know there was a direct relation, we don't want to engage in post hoc, propter hoc reasoning, but whether or not we know what the cause was, we know that the applications doubled starting in 2010, right?
That's my understanding.
So we've got the workload doubling. We've also established that there were no additional resources given to the IRS to do this work. Is one of the possible explanations that the staffers who were not acting for political reasons were actually acting to streamline their own work and try to get through a twice as high pile of work in a streamlined fashion so that they could actually get the work done?
Congressman, there are certainly valid reasons for the Internal Revenue Service to try to become more efficient in the way they identify these types of cases. However, it is entirely inappropriate for them to use certain categories in which to accomplish that.
Exactly. Now, one thing I want to ask you is, I think you've testified that you haven't really zeroed in on individuals because you've done an audit, not an investigation. Is that right?
That is correct, sir.
Why, Mr. George? In your testimony, you said that you were asked by several members of Congress to do an investigation. Why have you not done one so far?
Many of our activities, sir, are covered by Privacy Act rules, and again, in some instances, during the course of an audit, if an investigation were initiated, the audit would have to cease because of conflicts and a variety of other.
So you do an audit first, finish that, and then move to an investigation. I hope you will do that, and I want to finish with this question. did the IRS's improper prioritizing of certain groups for extra scrutiny, did that lead to any actual incorrect determinations of the tax-exempt eligibility of any groups? And I'll open that up to all three of you gentlemen. Do any of you know, did this improper conduct lead to improper decisions?
I will say that this action led to the fact that not a single application for this status, this tax-exempt status, was denied. They were delayed for years at times, but not a single one of the ones that we examined were denied. So it does raise questions in that regard.
Mr. Shulman?
Not that I'm aware of, but I defer to the Inspector General who's done the review.
Mr. Wolin?
I have no knowledge of this, Congressman. I too defer to the Inspector General who's looked at this.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Just to clarify what the gentleman was asking, none were denied, but by definition, not granting them is in fact not allowing them to happen. So you can actually deny better by not denying, because if you deny, they have a right of appeal. If you just let them sit in limbo, they're screwed, and some are still screwed today. Isn't that correct?
That's
a term of art.
I was going to say I wouldn't use necessarily.
But if you were a Tea Party organization, you'd use that term.
I would be very frustrated, sir.
Right.
Yes.
Two quick things to clarify, because the gentleman made a very good point. This doubling, isn't it true that they began targeting Tea Party before there was any doubling? That your own testimony shows between 2009 and 2010 there was not a marked increase, and they began targeting with just one Tea Party application and then expanded it?
They did, yes, sir.
Thank you. I think that makes it clear. Oh, one more thing. There were 479 or so of these Tea Party groups that were targeted in total. Were there any BOLOs issued for progressive groups, liberal groups? Because I'm assuming that your investigation, we can't see them, but your investigation showed liberal groups that flew right through during the same time and got their 501c4s. They were not stopped. Isn't that correct?
Sir, this is a very important question. Please, I beg your indulgence.
Of course.
The only be on the lookout, that is BOLO, used to refer cases for political review were the ones that we described within our report. There were other BOLOs used for other purposes. For example, there were lookouts for indicators of known fraud schemes, so they could be referred to the group that handles those issues. For nationwide organizations, there were notes to refer state and local chapters to the same reviewers. As we continue our review of this matter, we have recently identified some other BOLOs that raise concerns about political factors. I can't get into more detail at this time as to the information that is there because it's still incomplete, that we've uncovered that because it's still incomplete. And there are 6103 issues involved here too.
So clearly it's fair to say, though, that there was a BOLO for Tea Party, but not a BOLO for Move On or Progressive.
I'm not in a position to give you a definitive response on that question at this time, Mr. Issa, Mr. Chairman.
So are you saying today that there were other 501c4s, not specific, so much as one other 501c4 not previously identified during your IG audit that were in fact targeted and held in a similar way?
I cannot give you a definitive answer, sir, at this time, but I certainly will.
I only ask if there's at least one. Are you aware of at least one that was targeted using a BOLO that was a 501c4 in which they were targeted politically, but did not fall into this current report we have before us? I'm not asking for privileged information. I'm asking for one.
For the review, the purposes of the audit that we conducted, which was to determine whether they were looked for in the context of political campaign intervention, there were no others.
Thank you. As I recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, I want to express my deep condolences for the losses. I realize you flew through the night to come back and that you'll be leaving as soon as votes conclude. But again, I think all of us on the dais would offer our heartfelt condolences.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Tough day for the folks in Oklahoma. Very tough time for a long time. Mr. George, I want to clarify several things. One of them, you made the comment that so far none of them have been turned down. They just had this inordinately large amount of paperwork and additional questions applied to them, and it's a long delay with no response, and it's basically we'll get back to you at some point. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
Man, that sounds like the Keystone Pipeline to me. But that's a whole different issue. You had mentioned under your audit, people under investigation are not under oath, or not under investigation or audit, or are not under oath, and that the IRS staff has not been forthcoming on some of the things. Is that the statement that you used?
That's the inference.
Is that both staff and management that you've had conversations with, or have staff and management been in that conversation you feel like they've not been completely forthcoming in all the questions you've asked?
Is it, I'm sorry, your question is because management?
No, staff and management, both. When you say IRS personnel have not been completely forthcoming on some of the issues you've asked about.
That is an inference that can be made from the fact that we have not gotten clear answers.
So that's what I'm trying to ask is staff, management, so two different levels of individuals, you're not getting completely full answers that you expect when you ask them.
While I am not in those interviews personally, sir, that is my understanding.
Okay. Mr. Woolen, did you ever ask anyone at the IRS, because you had to hear about all these reports as well, that possibly political activity was happening within the IRS? It's been mentioned before already, 42 different major news stories were out there that there was potential targeting. Did you have a conversation with anyone, anywhere in the IRS where you asked the question, is this true or is this happening sometime after May the 3rd, 2012?
I did not, Congressman. Again, with respect to the details of how the IRS administers the tax code, especially...
No, I understand. I'm just asking, did you have that conversation where you asked someone, is this true? Is this happening? Because there were a lot of media reports before this came out.
I didn't. First, I was aware of this, Congressman. It was when the Inspector General came to me at some point in 2012 and said, on the basis of some congressional inquiries, he was going to begin an audit, and that was the first I learned of it.
Okay, so you didn't see any of the media reports over the group that you oversee?
I did not.
Okay.
That I recall.
Wow. Mr. Schulman, in my office, before a letter goes out, there are 4 different people, including myself, that go through that letter as it goes through the process of edits and review and fact checks and all those things. I assume it's very similar in your office as well, that you're not actually penning every letter. There are multiple people that are involved in the process on it. I am one of many that wrote a letter in 2012 to your office and received a response back from Steve Miller. In that response that I got back from Steve Miller about this exact issue, he said in those cases where the application raises issues for which there's no established published precedent, I assume that's the Tea Party groups and everything else, or no uniformity, EO determinations may refer the application to EO technical. EO technical, the applications are reviewed by tax law specialists whose job it is to interpret and provide guidance in the law and to work closely with IRS chief counsel attorneys on the issues. That's a lot of folks when there's new ground to be broken. Now, from my district, this is one of those letters that came in from someone in my district that specifically contacted me and had a whole series of questions that came back to them with what is in my area the Oklahoma City Patriots in Action Group. They were asked questions such as, have any candidates running for public office spoken, or will they speak at your function or organization? If so, include a transcript of any speeches given by candidates, which is remarkable to be able to ask. Do you directly or indirectly communicate with members of legislative bodies? And there's no definition for what indirect communication is given on that. It's just, have you had, I don't even know what that would mean. My favorite question, who developed the website and has control over the data generated by the website? Not only is that an insane question to ask, it's not even grammatically correct. 19A, provide all copies of your corporate minutes from inception to the present. This was asked, and at the beginning of the first page it says, under penalty of perjury, I declare that I've examined this information, and goes through in this long statement. My issue is this is new ground. And based on the letter that we received when I wrote the letter to you, it lists a long list of people that have to be involved in the formation of this. How do we get the list of individuals that were involved, or at least the process of how these questions were done? Because this assumption that this is a couple rogue agents does not match up with the letter and how we were told this was actually created. This includes technical folks, attorneys, chief counsel, EO. This is a pretty large list of people that are involved in creating this. Someone knew, in fact, a lot of someone's knew about this, because you can't form this without this. How do we get that information? Mrs. Lerner is obviously the best person to ask. She's chosen not to answer questions. How do we get that?
Look, as you said, there's probably other people who work on the details of that who you could ask. I would presume you ask it directly. I'd presume that the IG, who's now has a better understanding of this, would be able to be helpful. And I presume that the committee investigative staff will take letters like that in your questions and ask, who was involved.
If I can have the luxury here, Mr. George, is there any way to know about how many people? Has that been a part of your audit to try to determine how many people went into creating this and how many different offices? Because this lists at least 3 different offices and multiple groups of people that were referenced just in their response to me in creating one of these surveys.
My understanding is we have not make that determination, sir.
Wow. That might be something we need to know.
We will take that under advisement.
I yield back.
Wisconsin, Mr. Cohan.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And in Wisconsin, we try to find silver linings. And in this one, Mr. Chairman,
If you find one, then you can find a sunny day in a snowstorm.
Well, I found a small one. The inept and excusable actions of the IRS have done more to unify Democrats and Republicans than I've seen in my 5 months here so far. So that's what I'm going with. I'm going to try to work off of that.
I'd use it until we lose it, and hopefully we won't.
Exactly. Let me drill down a little bit in a different area, because I think a lot's been talked about, really the ineptitude of what had happened. But specifically, Mr. George, one of your recommendations I think that stands out the most is the better guidance to determine whether organizations are properly qualifying for the tax-exempt status, 501c4. Not related to the groups that have, but to the future, the fact that since the 2 years previous to Citizens United, there's a pretty even number of applications, and now in the last year that's more than doubled. So we're clearly seeing more activity in this area. If we really want to make sure, not through this sad way that was done through the IRS to try to find this out, but some other way. You, in your report, say that we need the acting commissioner for the tax-exempt government entities division to work with the IRS chief counsel and Department of Treasury to improve guidance to help determine the primary activity of social welfare organizations. That's correct?
That is correct, sir.
Okay. And to be clear, if a group's primary activity is political, they do not qualify for the 501c4, correct?
Again, as long as they pass that test of, not being their primary activity.
All right. And the IRS does, in your opinion, from the report, does not have adequate guidance so its employees can figure out this question. Was that your point?
That is definitely my point, sir. Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Shulman, you're no longer there, so I'm not going to ask you this question, but I am going to pivot to Mr. Wallen. The Treasury oversees implementing regulations for the tax code passed by Congress. And in this specific area, do you expect the Treasury to come out with some guidelines measuring the primary activity of 501c4 organizations so we can actually have some clear and concrete guidance for IRS employees?
Congressman, the existing guidance, as you know, is very old, is a very complicated area. But as the IG report recommends, and as this matter makes clear, we need to have some new guidance in this area. That's what the IG has recommended, and we have adopted all of his recommendations. So we will work with the new acting commissioner, Mr. Werfel, to see what additional guidance we can provide so that we can bring better clarity to this area and help avoid the kinds of things that we've just learned were happening.
And do you have a timeline on that?
Well, I think we're going to get to our work as soon as possible, but I don't have a specific timeline for you, Congressman, other than to say that the Secretary has charged the new acting commissioner with a report in 30 days that includes, among other things, how we're progressing with respect to the implementation of the various recommendations that Mr. George has put forward and that we have accepted.
I just think this is probably one of the areas, we can look at the problems that occurred and they were significant. And as you can see, there's complete unanimity in the room here looking at this saying this was inept and inexcusable. But I think the next step is how do we make sure, because of Citizens United, the growth of these applications, that we have a fair and level process to work off of. So as soon as you can do that, that would be much respected. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, I would just close in saying, I think this has been really great to have this in the open so everyone can see this, and it's been a very good hearing. I would hope that you would still consider tomorrow perhaps opening the Thomas Pickering hearing so that we could try to indeed have, as I think he's requested, a chance to do that.
Will the gentleman yield? The gentleman from Wisconsin yield?
Would my colleague yield?
Well, you've got so much yielding to do, I may have to give you more time.
Will the gentleman yield?
I thank my colleague. Mr. George, in response to Mr. Cartwright, you said something I don't think you're competent to say, and that is, when looking at your own report that showed the doubling of applications for 501c4s, you said, well, that's just coincidental to Citizen United. You don't know that. We don't know if it's causal or coincidental based on your analysis, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to acknowledge that.
I agree with your statement, but my point was that we did not indicate in our report
I understand.
that because of Citizens United, there was a doubling.
I understand. And is it not also true that a 501c4, one benefit of that versus a 501c3 is the donors don't have to be revealed? Is that correct?
That is my understanding, sir.
Thank you, Mr. George.
Well, gentlemen,
and I thank my colleague.
Gentlemen, yield the last 15 seconds.
You can have the last 10 seconds.
Mr. Woolen, yesterday Mr. Liu said senior aides at the White House, the Treasury Department, and the IRS debated the best way to break this news. When Ms. Lerner gave the speech and you had the planted question how you were going to spin this, how you were going to bring this forward, were you involved in those discussions on how this story was going to break to the American people?
No, I was not involved in
So you weren't one of the people at Treasury involved, even though it's your responsibility to oversee the IRS?
Congressman, there were, and I think there's been press reporting on this, conversations among folks in the Chief of Staff's office and among lawyers about these questions. I was not directly involved in those conversations, no.
Who at Treasury was?
Well, I think, again, we'll work with you to get the names, Congressman, but it were people in the Chief of Staff's office.
Do you know how the name Celia Rhodey, she was the person who planted the question, you know how she was chosen? And why she was chosen?
Congressman, I had no involvement, no knowledge of that until we learned about it probably together when there was testimony from Mr. Miller on that question. I have no knowledge of that.
Thank you. I just, Mr. George, following up on Mr. Pocan, just one quick thing. I had our staff check, and Citizens United was decided and announced on 21 January 2010, and the IRS began targeting Tea Party groups in March of 2010. Isn't that correct?
I'm not sure of the date of the...
Well, the first file pulled, according to Ms. Paz, would have been that less than 2 months later.
I'm not sure of the date of the issuance of the Supreme Court.
Oh, no, we can all get that at Google.
Right.
That's a fact online. But essentially, if there's a coincidence, the IRS began targeting in less than 60 days Tea Party groups after Citizens United was started. I would assume that it's awful hard to have this supposed exponential increase in applications in less than 60 days, especially since they had gathered starting with application 1. Isn't that essentially, without exceeding what Mr. Connolly would agree to, if there's a coincidence, isn't that the coincidence that it happened so close to the deciding of a Supreme Court case, not to the increase in applications?
It does seem coincidental, sir.
Thank you. With that, we go to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Schulman, are you familiar with any examples in which confidential information relating to the application for tax-exempt status of groups was leaked to any entity outside of the IRS?
I'm familiar with some press reports and have vague recollection of things happening.
So we're going to pick up one in just particular. Media reports asserts that Austin Goolsbee, then the President's Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisor, disclosed confidential tax information about Koch Industries to reporters on August 27, 2010. Do you have any idea how Mr. Goolsbee obtained that information?
Two things. One is, if I remember from the time, it wasn't confirmed that he had confidential information, and to the extent he did, if that's your premise, I have no idea.
The whole thing is that should have alerted you, because that's something very, very important. It kind of hit the screen it's a pretty big deal. So did you ask your staff at the IRS how this happened, and did you find out if anyone at the IRS provided Mr. Goolsbee with that information? Because it caused you, I just saw you with your caution, it caused you to think about it. and somebody in your nature should have gone back and asked. Did you ask anybody, yes or no, in the IRS to look into that, how you got that information?
It was several years ago, but my best memory is, and I have a recollection that the Inspector General was actually did an investigation to see if something had happened. But that's my best memory.
At that time?
It's very vague.
Is that true, Mr. George? I didn't think you were at that time investigating.
Congressman, this is one of the most frustrating aspects of implementing or overseeing the Internal Revenue Service, and those are some of the restrictions that the tax code places on me and my ability to communicate information to people outside of the Ways and Means Committee.
Okay.
The IRS has strict confidentiality rules, which we actually enforce, and which I'm not allowed to provide.
I appreciate that. I want to keep going here. So Mr. Schulman, how would that information be obtained? I mean, from your understanding of the IRS, you're the head here guy. How would that be obtained? It had to come from a leak, right?
It shouldn't be obtained. Section 6103 prohibits IRS employees from disclosing specific taxpayer.
You gave me my answer. So, Mr. Schulman, 6 months after Mr. Goolsbee made that public information, you went to the White House and met with him according to the White House records on February 3rd, 2011. Did you ask Mr. Goolsbee then or at any other time how he obtained that information?
Not to my recollection.
Why not?
Because there's lots of things that happen in the press that involve the IRS. I remember that meeting, but
But my understanding is this is a very important piece, particularly as a director, that you should have looked at. Because, by the way, sir, did you take an oath of office?
I did take an oath of office.
Okay, let's keep going. Are you familiar with the news organizations ProPolitica's publication of pending tax-exempt applications from conservative-leaning organizations?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Are you familiar with those publications? The news?
ProPublica?
Yes.
I'm familiar with the organization
Okay.
ProPublica.
It is my understanding, based on reports from that publication, that your office provided that publication with the applications that were still pending, which were confidential. Is that your understanding?
That my office? I saw news reports of issues around ProPublica that I remember, and I don't remember the time stamp. And again, my best recollection is when those news reports broke, that it was referred to the IG to look at.
So what contributed to the confidential pending applications making it through the internal review process and being provided to the publication?
I don't have any knowledge of the premise that it happened. I saw news reports.
Well, but it should have alerted you because, I mean, as a head person with these big things happening, you should have followed up. Beauty's in the detail. I've watched you all day. You're really good at certain parts of detail, and then you obscure the rest. I mean, there's a disease going in America. I see it in trials all over the country. We feign because somebody gets in our face that we don't acknowledge something. I want to go further. Are you aware that in July 2012, Senator Harry Reid claimed Mitt Romney hadn't paid taxes for the last 10 years and claimed to have the information supporting that? Are you aware of that? I'm sure you are.
I have a recollection of reading that in the paper.
Do you know how Mr. Reid obtained that information? Did you look into this?
I have no idea. How
Doesn't that alarm you that all of a sudden this pertinent information comes up, you're the head of this agency, and you're not asking questions? Shame on you. Absolutely shame on you. Did you ask for any other leaks of any other information, confidential information on anybody else? I mean, I've just now illustrated you 3 different incidences for private information, and yet you did nothing. So let me ask you again.
If the gentleman would conclude his questioning.
Yes. Did you faithfully take this oath, and I want to highlight it, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office in which I'm about to enter? Did you take that oath?
I took the oath of office.
Thank you. The gentleman has concluded. Mr. Woolen, do you want to answer the same set of questions? I think they were directed to Mr. Schulman as a former agency head, but you were his superior and still would be the superior to each of those questions. Were you involved? Did you investigate? Did you have concern particularly for sensitive IRS information?
I would say a couple things, Mr. Chairman. One, I was not involved in any of those things. I remember reading news accounts of ProPublica when it happened. I want to be sensitive, as the Inspector General has sort of instructed us, to 6103 issues. But the only thing I learned about one of those issues was from the Inspector General, who said he was looking into it. And of course, I did as I always do. I said follow the facts where they may lead, and otherwise stay out of the matter.
Mr. George.
Mr. Chairman, we at TIGTA do have exclusive jurisdiction to review these types of allegations. And again,
But you have no authority to go to the White House, go to here on the Hill, or go anywhere else for that investigation. You're extremely limited. You can't, as I understand, you can't leave Treasury for in your investigations.
No, that is not true. We do have the authority to go beyond Treasury, including the White House.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Of course,
just further clarification. Is it, some agencies, if they read something in the newspaper, as a matter of fact, members of Congress, we can be subjected to an ethics investigation just by somebody reading something in the paper or hearing about it. How does that work there with the IRS? Some mention was made of Senator Reid and others. How does it work there? Maybe you can answer that, Mr. So that we can all be clear. And so,
Thank you.
Go ahead,
briefly. I can assure you, TIGTA has exclusive jurisdiction to investigate unauthorized disclosures of return information, tax return information. Now, these provisions prevent me from discussing in any detail other than with the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee and the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. I can't even discuss these matters with the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, nor the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee, but also the chairman of the Joint Committee on Tax. So if a matter is in a newspaper and if it's publicized and if they name names, if I were to repeat the names publicly, I'm in violation of 26 Section 6103, notwithstanding the fact that
But could you do an investigation? That's the question I'm asking.
Yes, certainly.
All right.
Certainly we could.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Illinois, Mr. Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, Americans have a good reason to be outraged by the actions of the IRS, and I share their outrage. I'm just frustrated today listening to you. Beyond the mismanagement and the miscommunication that is well documented at this point, what troubles me most is the violation of public trust. It's clear that at several levels, from the misguided actions of the IRS staff in Washington, the IRS employees in Cincinnati, to yourself, Mr. Schulman, in your failure to disclose information to Congress, I just feel that you've really violated the public trust. And it's troubling because the IRS has such an awesome responsibility and such an incredibly important job to do, one that is central to how well our government operates. And as our tax code gets more and more complicated and IRS employees face furloughs and pay freezes, which, by the way, presidential appointees are exempt from, it is an increasingly difficult job to do. So I want to get at your comments in yesterday's Senate Finance hearing, and again today in response to my colleague, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Spears. You deny personal blame for the inappropriate criteria used by the IRS. So what will you accept personal responsibility for? How about the lack of training of the staff as identified by the IG? Will you accept personal responsibility for the failure to properly train the staff?
Look, I wouldn't go down a long list. I was the leader of the IRS at the time that this happened. I accept the fact that this happened on my watch, and I'm very sorry that this happened while I was at the IRS. I feel horrible about this for the agency, for the people there, for the great public servants. I'm not sure what else I can say.
Were you responsible for the training of the IRS personnel under your leadership?
I did not hands-on decide the training of 90,000 people.
So you will not accept responsibility for the training of the personnel under the IRS at your time there?
I accept that this happened on my watch.
So yesterday you said, talking about when someone found out about this problem, and you said when someone spotted it, they should have run it up through the chain. Why they didn't, I don't know. Do you accept responsibility for the poor reporting process up the chain, all the way to you, as you yourself have identified happened?
As I said yesterday, this should have been brought up the chain earlier so that it could have been addressed. There was clearly a breakdown in this one unit of the IRS and of the chain that moved up, and I accept that this happened on my watch.
Okay, so you won't accept responsibility that some sort of a process needed to be in place, or a check and balance to make sure that if there was a breakdown that that would be corrected, and that they were properly trained on how to report up the chain? No need to answer. Now, do you accept responsibility for your failure to correct the public record once you found out your testimony was not accurate?
I answered truthfully with the information I had, and I've said before, when I found out that a list existed, I did not have all the facts. At that time, the Inspector General was going to investigate, and I feel very comfortable that the actions I took were appropriate.
Okay. Mr. George, your report indicated that that after Ms. Lerner discovered the IRS employees in Cincinnati were using inappropriate criteria, she stopped them immediately. Is that correct?
That's, I don't know how you define immediately, but she did halt that behavior, yes.
Thank you. But then the employees started using slightly different but still inappropriate practices a few months later?
Correct.
Okay. How were these employees allowed to resume these activities after management stopped them the first time?
That is the heart of the question, Congresswoman, which we still do not have a definitive answer to. My response, if at this stage, would be a lack of oversight, a lack of follow-up on the part of Ms. Lerner and people within her immediate chain of command. No one went back to make sure that what was being told to do, by them to do in Cincinnati was being done, and that's inexcusable.
Mrs. Sherman, do you accept responsibility for Ms. Lerner's failures as your employee to follow up and provide the oversight necessary?
I have the same answer. This happened on my watch. I do not accept responsibilities for all the actions taken by all of the people outlined in the report.
Well, I am deeply disappointed in your answer, because right now, in forward operating bases in Afghanistan, all over the world, we have 25-year-old buck sergeants and second lieutenants who know you can delegate authority, you can never delegate responsibility, and that you're always responsible for the performance, the training, the actions of the men and women under you. And I hope that you remember that in the next position you go to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady would yield. I'm going to work with the ranking member, and we're going to either formally or informally ask the designate to be the next commissioner, who has been the director of the Office of Management and Budget, to come before us so that we can perhaps see in advance whether the management skills are there and the plan is there for what has clearly been a dysfunctional period of time.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes,
I just want to thank you. I made that request in my opening statement, and I thank you, because I think that's a major move.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that, we go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania who has been patiently waiting, Mr. Meehan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would like to begin to follow up a little bit on some of the information that was generated by my colleague from Oklahoma, because I'm standing and holding in my hand as well a questionnaire for one of the organizations that made an application. But their application was made in 2009. It's now 2013, and they still have not gotten a response. And yet here we are, 39 questions that are being asked. This is the second level of questioning. Now, we hear some of this is all being done for efficiency purposes and other kinds of things, and yet we have people that have 39 questions that they're asking on subsequent organizations. So the issue I have for you is there an ability to have these questions resolved, as was stated by your successor, by a few people down in Cincinnati, or is there another level of questioning that these matters are vetted? Mr. Schulman.
I guess I'm not sure I understand your question, but
You're
it's
the
about
testimony. The testimony of Mr. Miller the other day, your successor, was that this matter was contained. It was at his specific language. This was the result contained by a couple of low-level employees in Cincinnati. This is where I'm having trouble really understanding where this is all coming from. And it was his testimony that it was a couple of low-level people in Cincinnati. And now I'm seeing 39 questions that are sophisticated and complicated. And the question becomes, is there somebody else beyond Cincinnati that's participating in the vetting of these questionnaires?
The best of my understanding, I really don't know who approves all of the questions. It's pretty well outlined. I have made myself familiar with the IG report about requests for guidance and those kinds of things.
Mr. George, what do you know about this?
Actually, Congressman, one of our recommendations, which the administration has agreed would be...
Mr. George, I'm not asking about a recommendation about what would be. I'm asking about what has happened, because the testimony of Mr. Miller was this was contained to a couple of people back in Cincinnati.
Yeah, I'm not able to give to...
Well, let me give you a little bit of information because I have from the application. Now, this is the attorney who has actually made the application, and this is the words of the attorney. Indeed, more than one agent in Cincinnati has advised me that the instructions regarding the processing of the Tea Party-related organization clients were coming from the Washington, D.C. office.
Yeah,
now, were there other levels beyond Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, as was testified by Mr. Schulman's successor?
That is still to be determined, sir.
Well, what ambiguity is there? What have you looked at? What questions have you asked to determine that?
Yeah. I have not been personally involved in the interviews, but I do know that there have been conflicting information provided to my, again, auditors, not my investigators, sir, but my auditors, as to how this came about.
Did you ask the question specifically whether there was anybody asking or involved in these evaluations beyond the Cincinnati office back in Washington?
Yes.
And what was the answer?
Well, I beg your indulgence. Oh. Sir, can I get...
No, you can't get back to me. I want to know. He just whispered something in your ear. What did he say?
I couldn't hear, so... Repeat it, sir. Apparently, again, the determinations unit on a number of occasions, not obviously I don't know the instant matter you're discussing, had made requests to the technical unit in Washington for guidance on how to handle certain matters. The technical unit in Washington took...
So you're saying that this was a request that was made from the floor that went up and asked the technical unit. There was no involvement from anybody in Washington in the form of participating or directing in which things came up.
The answer is yes, but in this matter that...
There was involvement in Washington in which things came up?
Yes, because the technical unit...
All right, that contradicts the testimony of Mr. Miller, but please explain.
Well, the technical unit is located in Washington, and as I discussed much earlier at this hearing, the technical unit took an inordinate amount of time to respond to many of the requests from the...
5 years, 4.5 for this applicant.
But, sir, it's very important for me to point out, the administration has agreed to our recommendations. Our recommendations that they clear up all the backlogs, such as the ones that you're referring to. And so if they follow through on those recommendations, hopefully this matter that you're referring to now will be addressed.
Well, I have a series of other questions, but this is just so frustrating to me. You know, the whole question here is, we've heard this from time to time, just about accountability. And in all the scandals, we hear the same thing from time after time by the government officials that are involved. Benghazi, IRS, AP reporters, Fast and Furious. Time after time, we're hearing people, wasn't my job, I don't know, it was the other office, I was recused. I didn't find out about it until you found out about it. Where does the accountability begin? People's lives are on the line in these things overseas. People's constitutional rights are at stake here. Where does the accountability begin? I'll close with one comment. This was the President of the United States himself. These were his words on January 21st, 2009 in the memorandum. Governments should be transparent. Transparency promotes accountability and provides information for citizens about what their government is doing. Then he spoke to the heads of the organizations, and these were his words. Let me say it as simply as I can. Transparency and the rule of law will be the touchstones of this presidency. Don't let this president and this nation down.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Just
a quick point of order, if I could.
From Ohio seeks recognition.
I mean, I hope what Mr. Meehan said is right on target. I hope the chairman will look at calling in groups the victims, 4.5 years. I would love to have them in front of us, explaining what took place and what they had to go through. I hope we'll do that at a subsequent date.
I will direct staff to attempt to vet groups that can come before as witnesses. As the gentleman knows, and I think it's been said here, there's tremendous sensitivity as to personal information, but we certainly would welcome those groups asking us and then vet an appropriate panel. Mr. George, when on my opening statement, I did talk about something we talked about personally, which was that you could not rule out that there were other problems because of questions about internal controls, that discussion we had. I assume in response to Mr. Meehan, the same is true. Today, you may not be able to speak to intervention that came from above or any other place, but you can't rule out that there was some at some time.
That is correct, sir.
Thank you. We now go to the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. George, I want to ask you about a report that the IRS disclosed taxpayer information that it should not have. Section 6104A of the tax code allows public disclosure of an application for tax-exempt status only after an organization has been recognized by the IRS as exempt. Last November, ProPublica reported that they requested from the IRS applications for 67 different nonprofits. In response, the Cincinnati IRS office sent ProPublica applications or documentation for 31 groups. 9 of those applications were still pending and had not yet been approved, meaning they were not supposed to be made public. Mr. George, during the committee's transcribed interview with Ms. Paz, committee staff asked her how this happened, and she explained that an administrative employee in Cincinnati who was supposed to check each application to ensure that it had been approved before disclosing it had made a mistake. Ms. Paz also told us that when the IRS discovered this disclosure, they referred the matter to your office. Is that correct?
I cannot even acknowledge the existence of an investigation, Congresswoman, pursuant to Title 26, Section 6103 of the United States Code.
Okay, well, can I read to you what she told us? Ms. Paz told our investigators that your office determined that this disclosure was inadvertent. And I will read about the IG's review, and I quote, "They found that there was no evidence that the employee had done it for any political reason, that there was no reason to believe that it was anything other than a mistake." Can you tell us, Mr. George, did you in fact find any evidence that this release was intentional or that it was motivated by any political considerations?
Notwithstanding the fact that the victim is in a position to disclose his or her or its status, Congresswoman, I'm not able to comment on it.
Okay.
Pursuant to law, and I don't want to go to jail.
Well, I don't want you to go to jail either. Can you recommend taking any actions, even if it's generic and you're not talking about a specific case?
If there is a matter that was sent to us for investigation, I can assure you that we did investigate it, ma'am. We initiated over 143 unauthorized disclosure cases last year and counting. So.
Okay. Also, we do have a new acting commissioner, and he's tasked with addressing the problems and restoring faith in the IRS. What would be your best advice for the acting commissioner, and what are things you think he should undertake quickly in the next 30 days?
Thank you for asking that question. Mr. Warfield has reached out to me already and has requested a meeting as soon as this week to discuss some of the problems confronting the Internal Revenue Service. And I've made a commitment to work with him to help him become familiar with the problems within the IRS that we've identified and ways to hope in the future to avoid them. Well, obviously to address the problems that currently exist and to avoid future problems.
And do you foresee this meeting taking place within the next 30 days?
It's happening next week, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. I yield back. Yes.
Let me just add, just following up on what the gentlelady just asked you about. When Mr. Woolfolk comes in to meet with you, how much latitude do you have with regard to disclosure? You just cited, and rightfully so, things that you can't disclose and whatever. How much information can you provide him?
I have the ability to provide him, the Deputy Secretary, and the Secretary of the Treasury, again, along with the Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, the Chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and the Chairman of the Joint Committee on Tax, any and all information, sir.
So you'll be able to tell him about ongoing investigations and what you have found to date. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
So he would be in a position, therefore, to, I'm not saying he will, but I hope he will, to be able to make corrections and try to create a better situation and correct some of the things that we've been hearing and reading about. Is that right?
That is correct, but he is also confined by Title 26, Section 6103, so he'll be limited in terms of what he can publicly disclose. But
the most important thing, he will be supplied with adequate information so that he can begin to deal with this immediately. Because I think all of us want that trust restored with regard to the American people as soon as possible. So I'm hoping that you will disclose everything.
I certainly will, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we go to the gentleman from North Carolina who has been in and out of here, but who has been active on this issue. The gentleman is recognized.
Thanks so much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Woolen, so do you have meetings with Mr. Schulman and his then deputy, Commissioner Miller? Did you do that on a fairly regular basis?
I had, Congressman, quarterly management review meetings where we looked at broad issues with respect to the budget and to how their IT refresh was going and so forth. Again, taking full cognizance of this relationship with the IRS where we didn't engage in discussions, didn't work in the details of tax administration or tax enforcement.
Right. But so okay, roughly 4 times a year, you sit down, go over the budget, talk things through. That's good. They were, in terms of report stream, you're the appropriate person for that to happen in Treasury. I understand that. So you regularly have this meeting and you discuss budget issues. But this issue about IRS employees targeting conservative groups, did that ever come up in any of these meetings?
It did not. I have no recollection of that at all.
Okay, so knowing what you now know, do you think there might have been a concerted effort to kind of prevent the report stream? I mean, prevent this from coming to you?
I don't know, Congressman, exactly what was going on within the IRS on this. What I know is that in general, and this is Treasury IRS relationships for many administrations now of both political parties.
No, I understand.
Right.
We're not saying the IRS is a venerable organization, but certainly not as bad as what we've come to find out in this problem. So in May of 2012, the IRS had completed an internal review and investigation. Were you informed of that internal review and investigation?
No, Congressman, as I testified earlier this morning, I learned of that just in the last few days.
Okay, so no. Okay.
Right.
But were you informed, you were informed in June 2012 that the IG was undertaking their audit or review, right?
I'm not sure precisely, Congressman, when it was, but at some point, Mr. George came to me and said that he was undertaking an audit.
May, June, July, summer 2012.
Some point in 2012.
Some point in 2012. Was it perhaps before the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November? Just to establish as a fact here.
It may have been, Congressman.
Okay.
Again, I don't precisely recall when it was.
Mr. George, do you have some further vague recollection? Was it perhaps hot outside, or were you wearing an overcoat? I mean, some time frame for me. Not to be glib about it, but
No, sir. It was in the summer of 2012.
Okay, thank you. So, in the summer 2012, you're informed the IG is undertaking this review. Does this raise any sort of concern with you?
Well, what it raised for me is what I said earlier, which is once the IG is looking at an issue,
No, I understand. I'm separate from that. I'm not saying you go to Mr. George and try to manhandle him and say, don't do this. I'm not making that accusation, okay? Just to be clear. What I'm saying is, he brings this very serious matter to you. You've received letters from the left and the right in Congress to the Department of Treasury, among various other administration officials, right? They send letters to the Treasury and to the IG. It's their press reports. In the spring of that year, there's some concern. Your IG comes forward and says, look, we're going to take this review. Don't you go, this is kind of, a good thing? Bad thing? Come on, give me some sort of sense of your emotions. You're a human person, too.
Congressman, I did not have awareness of this issue before. I don't believe...
No. I'm not talking about your learning. I'm talking about your feelings. Let's talk about your feelings then. And when you heard the IG is going to do this, you're serving a president. The president appointed you. You're Senate confirmed. Very important position. You're there from the beginning of the administration. The IG comes to you and says, we're looking into this very damning thing. It's a presidential election year. You don't say for a minute, this is kind of frightening.
He didn't come to me with conclusions, Congressman. He came to me with the fact of the audit. So what I said to him was, this is important and you should follow the facts with the
Okay, so then take me from there. Do you tell anybody?
No, I not until much later.
When? Like when?
I don't know. I can't remember, but some point later, I came to learn that the IG had also told the fact of his audit to some other folks.
No. So we're talking about summer of 2012. The election is coming up. It's unclear who's going to win. Your guy that nominated you, I assume you still support him, but in 2012, you're looking at this election year, and you don't pick up the phone and say to your contacts at the White House, which, and say, just as a heads up, this could actually hit the fan in a presidential year.
I did not, Congressman.
Okay. And you don't tell anybody in the Office of Counsel at the White House?
I did not.
Okay. So the first time you learned about conservative groups being targeted by the IRS was when this report came out.
The first time I learned that there was before the report came out, a draft of the report was shared with IRS, and IRS staff, as I think is now public, had conversations with some people at the Treasury Department. I didn't have any understanding of the details, but I understood from Mr. George, I think at some point in the last set of weeks, that this was going to be a report that was going to reach a very damning conclusion. But I didn't have any understanding.
Did you give a heads up to the White House Chief of Staff?
I did not.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your indulgence. The absurdity of this is that when a huge accusation is being undertaken by an Inspector General in a presidential year, it is beyond me to think that an administration official wouldn't have maybe. Let me ask another question. Did you contact Chicago
The gentleman's
about
time has expired. Make it very quick.
Did you contact the campaign about it?
I never had any contact.
Okay,
thank you.
Make sure. Thank you.
Mr. George, just for the record, the date that the draft was shared, to your recollection, I think it's on your timeline.
A draft was shared with whom, sir?
With the Treasury.
Well, it would have been shared with we don't share drafts with the Treasury. We share them with the IRS.
I'm sorry, you shared with the IRS, and I thought there was a date you shared with the Consul for Treasury, or maybe I don't have that draft in front of me. You shared an unofficial draft. I just want to know if you have an official date on that one event. I just want it in the record.
March 28th, 2013, a discussion draft report was shared with the Internal Revenue Service.
Okay, so that's the date with the IRS. Correct. And the 27th was the acting commissioner.
Yeah, I have monthly meetings with the acting commissioner and his principal deputies that we.
So outside of the office of the Inspector General, before or after March 27, 28, were any other drafts or portions of drafts circulated outside of your direct reports?
If the question is whether TIGTA, my office, shared drafts, we would have shared drafts with the IRS, I believe.
Right. In this discussion draft, or this set of timelines you gave us,
right,
we only had the IG function head briefing, including the acting commissioner, and the discussion draft issued to the IRS the next day. Are there any other days in which discussion drafts or preliminary or portions were shared with anyone outside of your direct reports as the IG?
Sir, during the course of an audit, there is a back and forth sharing of information between the subject of the audit and our organization.
But the reason I ask is Mr. Schulman knows nothing. Mr. Wolin knows nothing. In almost any of these areas, either doesn't remember or didn't know. So can you make available to us, to the greatest extent possible, those back and forth discussions that occurred with anyone, including Ms. Paz and others, so that we have a complete record of sort of who knew what when? Because, as you know, we didn't know any of this until long after the 28th of March.
Very good. We will provide that.
Thank you. We now go to the gentleman from Illinois. We're on a roll on the Illinois folks, Mr. Davis.
That is correct, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding this hearing. Mr. George, let me also commend you for your stamina and composure. It seems to me that you've been testifying around the clock all week. This is my second encounter with you from another committee. Let me ask you, according to your report, about 1/3 of the organizations selected for further review were groups with the words Tea Party, Patriots, and 9/12 in their names. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, it is, sir.
Your report also found that as of December 2012, none of the applications submitted by these targeted groups had been denied. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
Several progressive groups have now come forward to say that they were also included in this enhanced review process. According to these groups, they also received requests for additional information, similar to those sent to conservative groups. The IRS asked them for detailed information about meeting minutes, officers and board members, and specific activities they conducted. These groups also experienced substantial delays in the processing of their applications, and in some cases were denied tax-exempt status. Mr. George, how is it that these progressive groups were included in the enhanced review if their names did not have the words Tea Party or other designated words?
Mr. Davis, well, first of all, in the course of this review, we were looking at political intervention, and that was the exclusive charge that we had. I have subsequently received information that what you're indicating may have occurred, and as a result, we will be conducting a follow-up review to determine whether or not that is the case, and if so, the extent of it.
Thank you. You testified yesterday that in conducting the audit, your office did not give further review to any of the more than 200 501c4 applications in your statistical sample and did not have Tea Party, 9/12, or Patriots in their title. Is that correct?
We looked, sir, I beg your indulgence. 202 non-Tea Party cases, and so the various groups that you just enumerated were reviewed for indications of significant political campaign intervention, which was our key criteria, again, in this exercise, in this review, Congressman. We did not evaluate whether or not they were conservative groups or progressive groups or liberal groups or whatever term you want to use, because those groups did not, again, have the be on the lookout terms, Tea Party, Patriot, or 9/12 in their names.
But then it is true that conservative sounding groups, or with the names that some people would associate with being conservative, were not the only groups who went through this process and were treated essentially the same way?
We did not make that determination, sir, for fear of not being able to determine what group stood for what position. But it is a possibility.
Thank you very much. And I got one question, Mr. Wallen. What is your title?
I'm the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Congressman.
And the Internal Revenue Service reports up through you?
It does.
And when they encountered these applications, did anyone come to you for advice or come to you and say, we're getting all of these applications, we're not sure what to do?
Deeply saddened and dismayed that it's happening at the agency.
What would be justice to you? What would restore the faith in the American people in the IRS, in your opinion? What should be done?
I don't have all the facts, and I'm not in a position to, I'm outside of the government at this point, so it's not my decision what should be done.
Okay, but you admit that people were targeted, and you found out about that over a year ago. You knew that conservative groups were targeted.
No, over a year ago, was informed that there was a list. I did not know the details. I didn't know the severity.
A list of people who are targeted. This is really hard for you to say. Everyone else is saying it, but you can't say that there were groups targeted.
As of May 2013, so sitting here today, I mean, you can call it what you want.
A year ago, you didn't know the groups were being targeted. Did Mr. Miller, your predecessor, did he know the groups were being targeted?
I can't tell you what he knew. I can tell you what he told me.
What did he tell you?
It's what I said, that he told me that there was a list, that the word Tea Party was on it. We didn't know what else.
And when did you know this? You knew this before the election.
What's that?
You knew this before the election.
Sometime in the spring of 2012.
Okay, and that would be before the election, I believe. You did know there was an election going on that year.
Excuse me?
You did know there was a presidential election.
I'm aware that there was an election last.
All right. Do you think that type of information could potentially harm the president in an election year? Did that cross your mind?
No, that did not cross my mind. I was the commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, and when I got a piece of information of concern, I viewed my obligation not to think about elections, but to think about, once information came to me, was it being handled properly? And as I've said before, I've been told that it had been stopped or was in the process of being stopped, and that
And as a good leader, that was good enough for you.
Excuse me?
As a good leader, that was good enough for you.
I feel very comfortable with my actions.
Oh, okay. What about the credibility of the IRS moving forward with implementing the healthcare law? A year or so ago, you and I had a conversation in this room about the IRS's readiness to implement the healthcare law. You felt that even though it took 55 minutes for someone calling about a tax question to talk to a human being and get an answer, that you felt comfortable that we would be ready to implement this healthcare law. How do you feel about that today? I know this won't be your responsibility. Do you still think the IRS is ready and has the confidence of the American people to share their most personal information with them to go ahead and implement the new healthcare law?
I think a couple things. I think, one, the last couple of years, Congress has not been funding the IRS sufficiently. And, I would defer to the Inspector General, who's done some looks at least when I left, had been looking at, is the IRS ready to implement its portion of the Affordable Care Act?
Are they competent to do it? Are they trustworthy enough? This is personal information people are going to have to share. I mean, we have to restore the confidence, and we don't even know what we're going to do in this case where our most basic freedom of speech has been violated. And you don't know whether anyone should go to jail. You don't know who should be held accountable.
I feel very confident in the men and women of the IRS to do the tasks they gave them. There was clearly a serious breakdown in this unit and in this topic here, and it's very serious, and the committee should be looking at it, etc. But I feel very confident in the capabilities of the IRS broadly and generally.
We'll see if America shares your views, and I yield back. I think the gentleman from Vermont is recognized.
I thank the gentleman
for this hearing and support the aggressive investigation. Mr. Chairman, you're known to be aggressive, you're known to be persistent, and those are qualities that are going to serve us well in this effort. There's really two issues. The first that's vitally important is, has the principle of equal protection and equal enforcement of the law been violated? And the second question is whether First Amendment rights have been infringed. Those are the focus of this hearing, and I support the aggressive efforts of this committee led by our chairman and ranking member to A, determine the facts, and B, follow the facts wherever they lead. America deserves an answer. And the fundamental question here is whether or not, at the end of this investigation, the conclusion is this was poor judgment and mismanagement, or were these actions politically directed and politically motivated by politically powerful people? That's our oversight function. And you're pursuing that, as you've said, aggressively, and we support that, both of you. But there is an oversight function, as Mr. Cummings said. And the oversight question asks us the question as to what is going on in the campaign finance world that we all live in. It also raises the question as to whether or not America's institutions are failing the American people that they serve. This was a failure by the IRS, whichever conclusion the facts lead us to. Just the conduct that raises legitimate questions as to whether or not there's been selective enforcement and politically motivated action compromises the ability of that institution, the Internal Revenue Service, to have credibility to do the job that the law requires it to do. But this mess goes back to a decision by the United States Supreme Court in Citizens United. In that case, in my view, the court made what I think is an absurd decision. They said a corporation is a person. You know, corporations have rights and they should be protected. Corporations serve a very important function in our economy and those should be promoted. But a person like you or like me, that's just nutty. You know, when it comes to this question of personhood, Mr. Chairman, and I'm talking about this because of our oversight function where I hope we do find some common ground, the Supreme Court gets it wrong. In 1857, in the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court said an African American was not a person. That is a stain on the court, it's a stain on our history. That was corrected by this Congress in 1868 with the 14th Amendment. And one of the challenges we face as a Congress is whether or not we're going to acknowledge what has happened in campaign finance since Citizens United. And let me just give a few facts, because this is really, I think, my view, a threat to the access to democracy by everyday people. Last presidential election, our candidate spent $1.1 billion between what he raised and what outside groups.
Put a B on that one, if you would. Billion, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And the Republican candidate spent about the same. And, you know, in the quaint old days when President Clinton ran for his first race, he spent about $42 million, that's an M, and Mr. Dole spent about $44 million. In the congressional races that we have all been engaged in, the House races were $1.1 billion. And the Massachusetts Senate race, $82 million. A House race in Florida, $23 million. And what has happened with all of this money coming into the political process, and I think we've all experienced this because I've talked to my colleagues, there's more 30-second attack ads. They do nothing to elevate the debate or explain the sharp divisions we have on a legitimate issue of taxing and spending. There's less control that each of us as a candidate have over what it is we're promoting to the people we're trying to represent, because outside groups are starting to spend more than the individual candidate does. There's more despair by citizens that we all represent that this political system has anything to do with anything they care about. And this is something I've noticed as a member of Congress. There's less ability for us to try to find common ground and make compromises that are in the public interest because some loopy billionaire
on your side or ours can flood the airwaves with an avalanche of cash criticizing us because we actually dare to make some compromises. So this campaign finance system, in my view, Mr. Chairman, is in dire need of reform. So yes, let's get to the bottom of this situation, but let's also acknowledge that this money that is coming into the political system is a very threat to our ability of this institution to do the job that the people expect it to do and the Constitution requires us to do. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to a gentleman who got here based on his ability as an attorney, not on based on being a billionaire. Mr. Gowdy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Schulman, when you learned that conservative groups were being targeted by the IRS for discriminatory treatment, what did you do?
When I learned of the existence of a BOLO list, in that same conversation or right around that time, I also learned a couple things. One, that it was being stopped. So that.
All right, and who told you it was being stopped?
That's Steve Miller, my deputy.
All right, and did you investigate further? Can you give me the name of a single person who was involved in the original decision to target conservative groups for disparate treatment?
I'm not aware of those names.
Why can't you give me a name?
So at the same time that I learned and that it was being stopped, I was also told that the Inspector General was aware of it.
Mr. Schulman, is the Inspector General the only person who can investigate wrongdoing within the IRS?
My general practice.
Can you answer my question and then you can explain? Is the Inspector General the only entity who can investigate wrongdoing?
Congress can investigate.
How about you? Can you do it?
The practice at the Internal Revenue Service that I inherited.
So if there's inappropriate conduct being done on your watch in the IRS, then that inappropriate conduct can last as long as the Inspector General's investigation lasts. Is that what you're telling me? That you're not going to step in and stop it?
No, what I'm telling you.
If there's someone wielding a knife in the parking lot, are you going to call the Inspector General? Are you going to wait until his or her investigation's over before you stop it?
When I was told about these allegations, I was also told that they were being stopped, and so that the inappropriate criteria were not being used.
And despite the seriousness and potential criminality of that conduct, you didn't investigate it yourself at all?
So the procedures that I inherited and that my
Mr.
general
Schulman,
practice
this is going to go
with
much quicker if you'll answer yes or no, and then you can explain. Did you do anything to verify that the practice, as insidious as it was stopped?
The Inspector General was going to be looking into it, and that's what.
Is it that you can't say yes or no, or you're just choosing not to say yes or no? Can you answer the question, did you do anything personally to make sure that this insidious, discriminatory practice was stopped? Yes or no?
At the time that I learned about it, I also learned two things. The first was that it was being stopped, and the second was that the.
And what did you do to verify that it was stopped?
The responsible deputy of the Internal Revenue Service told me it was being stopped. I had no reason to believe otherwise.
Did you investigate why conservative groups were being targeted?
Excuse me?
Did you investigate? So you can't give me a single name. You can't answer the who. Can you tell me the why? Why were conservative groups? Why was the culture such under your watch that an employee felt comfortable targeting conservative groups? Did you investigate that?
You know, from my reading of the report, I can't tell if it was political motivation or if it was tone deaf, somebody trying to expedite a way.
You still don't know that this was political.
Excuse me?
You still don't know that this was political?
I defer to the Inspector General.
Well, I'll tell you this, Mr. Schulman. Your predecessor said that he wasn't sure if it was partisan, and that requires the listener to be as stupid as the speaker to utter a comment like that. He just testified that policy positions dictated this. What does that mean to you? If it's not partisan, what does that mean?
I'm not sure I heard that testimony.
Well, we'll be sure and get you a copy of the transcript and you can supplement your testimony. How's that? Do you agree with Dan Pfeiffer?
Committee's questions.
Do you agree with Dan Pfeiffer that the law is irrelevant, or do you think it is relevant?
I think the law is always relevant.
Do you think 26 U.S.C. 7214, which provides for criminal penalties for this conduct, would be relevant? And did you refer the matter to someone with law enforcement investigative jurisdiction?
I'm not going to speculate what's appropriate legally in this matter, and Mr. George, I knew his operation was looking at it, I believe.
I thought it was an audit. I thought he just testified it was an audit, not an investigation. Did you refer it for criminal investigation?
I didn't refer it. It was already being looked into at the time that it was brought to my attention.
So I want to be real clear because my time is out. The only recourse you have when there's an allegation of wrongful conduct on your watch, the only thing you feel comfortable doing is waiting on an inspector general to finish his or her report.
The general practice is to make sure the inspector general will look into it.
No matter how insidious the conduct. If it were an allegation of racial discrimination, you would have waited until Mr. George finished his investigation. Is that your testimony?
I'm really not going to answer hypotheticals.
I tell you what, instead of answering a hypothetical, why don't you answer the case at bar today? If there's an allegation that groups are being discriminated against based on political ideology, are you really going to wait until an inspector general finishes his or her report before you take corrective remedial action?
When I have a fact, but I don't have all the facts, and I don't know the scope and severity.
Did you investigate the facts, Mr. Schulman? Did you lift a finger to identify the facts?
Felt very comfortable. The facts, the inspector general was going to run down the facts, and once he had it, it would be reported out.
Let the record reflect that's a no.
I thank the gentleman. I know you guys have been there a long time. We appreciate your patience. We've got to give you time to use the men's room. So we're going to take a short recess, 5 minutes. The chairman is headed over to votes. We're going to be, did votes just get called? Votes just got called, so we're going to 5 minutes. We're going to bring you back. And when the chairman gets back from voting, I'm going to try to run. We're not going to recess. We're just going to give you a restroom break. All right.
No worries.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
So the House Oversight Committee now taking a break in this hearing, looking into the IRS's targeting of conservative groups that apply for tax-exempt status. This should just be a 5-minute break. Some members may be heading over to the floor of the House. The House voting right now on a bill that would expedite the permitting process for construction of the Keystone XL oil pipeline from Canada to the U.S. By the way, you can watch the House live right now on our companion network, C-SPAN. And we've been keeping track of social media, and on Twitter specifically, the handle IRS. We're looking for some of your comments and reaction to this hearing that's taking place today. From Victor Warden, he says, I have to thank those in the GOP oversight for their tenacity in seeking answers about the IRS in Benghazi. The law must be upheld. Anthony Caranci says, I think that everyone getting audited should be allowed to give the same type of answers as these IRS officials. And Liberate the USA says, can we agree the IRS has outlived its usefulness and is an obsolete relic that now needs to be dismantled?